Hey everyone, and welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. I've got another hardware review for you today. This time I'll be taking a look at the Anbernic RGCubeXX. This one borrows most of the form factor from the original RGCube, but downsizes the price and performance and swaps the positions of the left analog stick and D-pad. So how is it? Well, we'll get to that in just a sec. First up, the normal disclosures. This RGCubeXX was sent to me for review by ToRetro.com. They are not seeing this review before it goes up, nor do they have any input into it whatsoever. As always, the thoughts and opinions expressed here are 100% my own. One more disclosure, ToRetro has set up this 10% off code for viewers of this video, and no, I do not get any money if you decide to buy it from them. They offered, and that was great, but I personally felt that would be crossing a line between reviewer and product supplier that shouldn't be crossed and could never be uncrossed. So I blissfully collect $0 for any purchase you might eventually decide to make. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk CubeXX. First, you might think Anbernic decided to go with a different chipset instead of the H700 for their newest device, since they've made so many devices with that chipset already. If you think that, well, you're wrong! I've already covered similar devices like the RG35XXSP and the RG40XXV. There are currently 8 devices from Anbernic using the same system on a chip to power the device. Why so many? Well, remember, Anbernic doesn't make games or software, so they have to make all their money on selling hardware. One way they can keep people buying hardware with the same chipset is to make changes to the form factor. And as long as they're meaningful and provide a different experience, I think that's alright. So are the changes made to the CubeXX meaningful, and does it provide a different experience? Well, that's what we're about to find out. First, let's talk look and feel. The RGCubeXX is available in 3 colors, black, white, and gray. I decided to try out the gray one since it looks different from most of the other devices that I have. Now the gray is a little bit warmer than I expected, but it still looks fine. Build quality wise, this is more of an entry-level device, and for the most part it feels like one. And I don't mean that it feels cheap or bad or anything like that. In fact, I'd say it's generally on par with the RG40XXV, which is one of the nicest feeling lower cost devices I've tried. But there is a noticeable difference between this and handhelds that cost, $200 to $300. So depending on your configuration, the CubeXX is going to be anywhere from $50 to $70 as I write this. When it comes to controls, the CubeXX has more of a Genesis or Japanese Saturn style D-pad. It doesn't feel as glorious as the D-pad on the Anbernic RG Arc systems, but it's good, and this is my second favorite Anbernic D-pad, right behind that one. The only thing about it that I'm not crazy about is that it feels a little stiff, and it can also stand to be just a smidge taller. Even so, it's much better than the D-pad on most other devices that rely on the Nintendo Plus shaped D-pad. And the face buttons? I'm happy to report they're all great. Some earlier Anbernic devices felt off in a lot of ways, and sometimes the face buttons just didn't feel right. But I'm happy to report that the face and shoulder buttons on the CubeXX are all really good. Again, some of the nicest I've seen in this price range. The menu button is down on the bottom left near the left analog stick. Start and select are on the bottom right. I kind of wish all of these buttons were up at the top of the system instead of the bottom. It feels unintuitive to reach down to press them, but quality-wise they're all fine. Then we have the screen. Famously, or infamously, the original Anbernic RG Cube was plagued by an issue with light bleed. On my CubeXX unit, I didn't notice any light bleed at all. I also haven't seen any reports of light bleed from anyone else who has this device at this time either. So it looks like that Anbernic has at least solved that problem for the release of the CubeXX here. Now the analog sticks are, well, not fantastic. I started to wonder if they were analog at all, since in the included controller test application, the left analog stick just duplicates the D-pad and the right analog stick just duplicates the face buttons. So I opened up PPSSPP here, since that system supports analog sticks, and I used its built-in analog test to confirm that they are actually analog inputs. Personally, for the types of systems and I think most other people will want to play on the CubeXX, the analog sticks are really kind of a bonus. And while I don't really play any systems that require the use of an analog stick on the CubeXX myself, I do appreciate the thumbsticks just for saving strain on my thumbs for things like vertical shooters. I find it a lot less taxing on my thumb to use the stick rather than the D-pad these days. I should also point out here that the L2 and R2 buttons are digital, not analog. So be prepared for that if you decide to pick up a CubeXX for yourself. Again, considering the types of systems for which the CubeXX is ideal, I'm okay with that. Let's check out the rest of the device now. On the bottom side, we have 2 bottom-firing speakers. I'm not a fan of bottom-firing speakers for reasons that I will talk about shortly. There are also 2 micro SD card slots as per many Anbernic devices. The left is for the device's operating system and the right is for ROMs and other user files. From what I've seen, it looks like ROMs are not included with the CubeXX by default, which is a good change that I hope Anbernic makes permanently. We've also got a handy-dandy headphone jack right here in the middle of the unit. Now on the top of the CubeXX, from left to right, we've got the power button, volume down and up buttons, a USB-C charging port, a reset button, and a mini HDMI out port. If we look at the back of the CubeXX, aside from the Anbernic branding and a device info in the center, you can see we have nicely shaped hand grips which do make the CubeXX pretty comfortable to hold. The textures on the inside of the grips are just that, textures. They aren't paddles like you might find on some other devices in that position. While rear paddle style buttons can be handy, I have to say I really prefer my devices and controllers without them, since I tend to hit them way more by accident than on purpose. So one question I always ask when I see a new device of any type is a very simple one. Who is this device for? In the case of the CubeXX, we've got 7 other devices from Anbernic with the exact same internal hardware. And that's just as of this recording, so who knows, there might be more by the time it goes live or shortly thereafter. If you've already got one of these entry-level style devices from Anbernic, why would you even think about buying this one? Well, I'll answer those questions for you right now. The big draw of the CubeXX and the thing that differentiates it from other devices in this price range is of course the screen. It's just a smidge under 4 inches and it comes in at a resolution of 720 by 720. The clarity and color reproduction are really good for a screen of that resolution, and the viewing angles are fantastic. Although I think the screen on Anbernic's prior H700 device, the RG40XXV, still looks just a smidge richer. When these more squarish screens started appearing in devices from a few companies, people wondered what they were all about and who they would appeal to. But the answer is actually pretty simple. Or answers, I should say. Now these screens are very close to the Game Boy and Game Boy Color aspect ratio. Also, they make playing vertically oriented arcade games much more pleasant than on 4x3 or 16x9 screens. So if you really like Game Boy and Game Boy Color games and or vertical arcade games, something like this might be right up your alley. And other systems like the Game Gear and Neo Geo Pocket and Neo Geo Pocket Color are also ideal on a screen like this one. So while those are the best and most obvious reasons to own the CubeXX, playing older 4x3 systems on it isn't too bad either. RetroArch supports a ton of different aspect ratios, and you can play around with them until you find the one on a particular system that you think makes it look best. And while you can get these games looking pretty nice with a very gentle stretch, if 4x3 games are mainly what you want to play, I'd have to recommend one of Anbernic's other systems with a 4x3 aspect ratio screen instead of this one. You can still enjoy 4x3 games on the CubeXX, but it's really built for those other systems I mentioned a moment ago. Where things will fall apart is when we're talking about any 16x9 systems, which isn't a big deal here, since the only one you can really play on the CubeXX with its H700 system on a chip is the PSP. And no, PSP games are not pleasant to look at on the CubeXX's screen. It's kind of like playing a vertical arcade game on a normal 16x9 screen. There's way too much negative space above and below the screen, and the game itself is tiny at normal aspect ratios. You can stretch the image to fill all or most of the screen, but honestly for PSP games that looks kinda terrible. Now it strikes me those last 2 points may have come off a bit negative, but keep in mind, this whole section is about who the device is for. And the answer to that question is that this device is for retro gamers who want to play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Gear, Neo Geo Pocket, Neo Geo Pocket Color, and vertically oriented arcade games. It excels at all of those things. You still have some extra space on the sides in vertically oriented arcade titles, but much less so than on a 4x3 screen. So if you want to play games on those platforms in one of the most pleasant and accurate ways possible via emulation, then the CubeXX is for you. If you're a huge GB or GBC fan, you might want to pick one up even if you have other retro gaming emulation systems, just to have the games fill the display with little to no negative space. Alrighty, usually I do performance analysis in the middle of these review videos, but I saved it for the end here. Why? Well, because if you've seen reviews of any Anbernic H700 devices, you already know exactly what to expect here. You'll be able to play almost anything from the dawn of gaming up until the 16-bit era without a hitch. On top of that, you'll get support for systems like PlayStation, Virtual Boy, Game Boy Advance, PSP, and some 32-bit arcade games. They work just like any other device running the same hardware. Now, one quick note, and this is important. Don't use the Games Room launcher from the main menu to launch your games. Do not do it. It uses emulators with settings that by default will give you a pretty bad experience. You'll see frame skipping and weird filters on systems that should run great, but instead they'll run terribly. So do not run these games in this way. If you've seen the comments section on some of my other H700 device reviews, like the 35XXSP or the 40XXV, you'll see that people sometimes miss this part of the video, and it's probably the most important part of the entire video. Launch all your games from the RetroArch menu, or launch RetroArch from settings and manually load your games from there. You'll get much better performance. Now, having said that, all the major classic systems work fine. As you can see here, Game Boy and Game Boy Color look and run great on the CubeXX. Game Gear, Neo Geo Pocket, and Neo Geo Pocket Color also look and run great as you'd expect. Here's a smattering of games on 4x3 systems, including the Genesis, PC Engine, SNES, 32X, and Sega CD. I've adjusted the aspect ratios in a few of these games so you can get an idea of what kind of difference it can make. As you can see, it's not difficult to get 4x3 games looking pretty good, and some games with resolutions naturally closer to 1x1 ratios, like the SNES with its 256x240 resolution, look good and not like they're being stretched too much in many of the available aspect ratios. So this is one of these things where if you want to play these games, you'll have to mess around to change the settings to whatever you think looks best, and you'll really get there through trial and error. Now, Dreamcast and PSP will be kind of iffy, and this is what they look like with all the default settings. Honestly, I'll probably never play them on the CubeXX. I'd save these systems for something more powerful like the Odin 2. But if this is the only retro gaming system you have, and you really want to play these games on it, well, you'll be able to get some of them to work. Like with all H700 devices, your performance results will vary greatly by the game that you're running on these more difficult to emulate systems. Oh, and another quick note, like all my hardware reviews, I'm reviewing the CubeXX as it comes out of the box with the stock firmware and operating system, the way Anbernic intended. I'm not installing custom firmware like MinUI, even though it's available. I will probably take a look at that in some future videos, but for now, I'm reviewing the stock experience that everyone gets when they get a brand new CubeXX. I'll also note in this section that battery life was as expected, and depending on your brightness level and the systems you play on the CubeXX, it'll last between 5 and 6 hours. Note that if you play more demanding systems, you can expect that time to be reduced a bit, but the worst battery life I've gotten so far during testing was right around 4 hours. Having said that, the majority of the time I was closest to about 6. Alrighty, so I think we've seen enough here for a pretty comprehensive review of the Anbernic RGCubeXX. If you've never seen a one-to-one screen on a device like this before, it can look a little weird, like someone just took a 4x3 device and squeezed it together a little bit. But the design has a purpose, and that's to make it an ideal emulation handheld for games on older handheld systems. And for that purpose, it's really good. And as I mentioned, vertically oriented arcade games look very nice on it too. On the downside this time around, I'd say any system with a wider aspect ratio, including the Game Boy Advance, doesn't really look ideal on a system like the CubeXX. Also, the bottom firing speakers are a bit of a disappointment, and they can easily get muffled, especially if you're playing in bed and kind of resting the device on your body while playing. It looks like there would have been plenty of room to engineer those speakers onto the front of the unit, and honestly, every device should have front-firing speakers these days. If you ask me, that's an absolute must. The D-pad could stand to be a smidge taller and a little looser too, but Street Fighter fans will still have very little problem executing all their moves. When all is said and done, I'd consider the CubeXX as a specialty device because of its design and square screen. And there's room for devices like these, which is evidenced by just how many devices have started showing up with screens like this one. And in a price range that tops out at a max of about $70, it's a specialty device worth owning if you don't already have one with a screen with this aspect ratio. I'm giving the RGCubeXX a review score of 8 out of 10. The CubeXX isn't meant to be your only emulation device. It's an ideal companion device to something more powerful with a 16:9 or 4:3 screen to let you play those old portable games in a way that really makes them pop and look great. The same goes for those vertically oriented arcade games. They just look nicer on a screen that's closer to their original aspect ratio. The CubeXX is well made for a device in this price range, but there's still room to improve things. In this case, I would really like to have seen that taller, looser D-pad and front-firing speakers. But other than that, it's very good at what it does. And I have no problem at all recommending it to anybody who wants it to play those systems I mentioned earlier. So what do you think? Do you have a CubeXX or any other square aspect ratio devices like this one? What do you think of this device and form factor? Would you consider getting something like this? Let me know all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here through channel memberships on YouTube. While the CubeXX for this video was provided for review, 99% of the time as of this recording, if I want to review something, I have to buy it. So that's where your money goes. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.